Hey everyone, thanks for clicking on the video. Before we start things, I just wanted to mention that I was looking at my subscriber count the other day and I noticed that 92% of you who watches my videos ain't actually subscribed. So if you could, please click on that subscribe button because it really does help the channel out. And also, once we do hit 500 subscribers, I can finally do my giveaway of a free copy of WWE Battlegrounds on the console of your choice. So, after saying that, thanks again, and now please enjoy the interview. Hello, welcome to that 90s Wrestling Podcast. I'm your host, James Tunstall, and today's special guest, what can I say, to paraphrase Sheamus and Cesaro, he didn't set the bar for wrestling interviews, he is the bar, Mr. Chris Van Vliet. How you doing, Chris?
I'm doing great, James. Wow, I don't know. If I've set the bar, I think we got to start looking for someone else to I don't know. I feel like we should set the bar a little bit higher than this.
It's all good. I mentioned to some fellow podcasters that you was coming on the show, and they're all excited, just looking for your words of wisdom and little tidbits they can pick out. So, like the interviews you've done has been so great. So you have, for a lot of young podcasters, you're an inspiration for a lot of them.
Oh, that's so awesome to hear. And the great thing about the world that we're living in right now is that anybody can do this. You know, if you've got a microphone and a camera, or if you just have a laptop or phone that has a camera, we're all on an equal playing field right now. And that's what's super exciting about content creating in 2021.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, Chris. So last year, so back in April, May, so for a while, I've been sitting on starting a podcast, and I was like, what should I do? How should I? It was always going to be revolved around wrestling, but I was kind of thinking, what should I do? And eventually, obviously, during lockdown, I was locked indoors for 3 months. So I thought I might as well do something. So I started it and started off just reviewing 90s WWE pay-per-views, then eventually getting guests and now yourself. And yeah, it's just gone from there. So it's getting that bit of courage just to do that first podcast, I think.
Well, I always say, James, the two hardest things about podcasting are, number one, actually starting the podcast.
Yeah.
And then number two, continuing the podcast that you started. So congrats to you, because you've ticked both of those boxes now.
We're getting there. We started off small, but just like some of the guests I've been able to talk to, I didn't think I'd be able to speak to them. So, we've all got the bucket list, which we'll talk about. So we'll get started. So your childhood, I would imagine you was a fan of wrestling growing up.
I was. I mean, I wasn't a massive fan probably until the Attitude Era, and I would have been 14, 15, 16 in the Attitude Era. But yeah. I remember, I grew up in the 80s. I was born in 1983. I remember being at my grandparents' house, and it's not like my grandpa was a huge wrestling fan, but he loved sports. So if baseball or hockey or football wasn't on TV or basketball, then wrestling was on. And I remember specifically being like the late 80s, like Saturday night wrestling was on, and you'd see all of the amazing characters from that time, the larger than life characters from that time. And then some of that must have stuck with me, because when I started high school and they made an announcement that they had tryouts for the wrestling team, I was like, ooh, the wrestling team, that sounds right up my alley. I mean, little did I know that it was going to be vastly different from the WWF that I was watching on TV. And it's funny because when you're on the wrestling team, you're told what we do in here, this is real. And what they do on TV, I mean, that stuff's fake. So there's this real divide between the quote unquote real and the quote unquote fake stuff. But it was not long after that I just got completely engrossed in wrestling. And when I become passionate about something, I dive all the way in. I don't check the temperature of the water. I don't check the depth of the water. I just dive all the way in. I'll figure it out when I get in there. But it was Austin McMahon that was the big storyline going on at that time. And I was all in from that point until now.
Cool. And I was listening to some of your interviews, and you mentioned to John Morrison, I think I've got this right, you actually done a couple of weeks in the wrestling school, and I think you was with Angelina Love and Tracy Brooks, am I right?
Yeah, in a wrestling school in Toronto called the Squared Circle. So this was my dream. I wanted to be a pro wrestler. I was a backyard wrestler in high school. It's always so embarrassing to admit that. But yeah, Chris Sharp was my backyard wrestling name. And I said that, when I was old enough and when I had the money, I was going to go to wrestling school. And that's exactly what I did. I went to wrestling school when I was 20. I was going in between like college being done that year was the summer between, 2 semesters. And I loved it. It's a lot of hard work and it hurts way more than you would ever expect it to. But I was doing it and I was in there with, all of those people, Angelina Love and Tracy Brooks. And there was some great talent to come out of there. Ashley Six came out of there, and I'm going to list off a whole bunch of people that if you're from Ontario, you'll be like, oh my gosh, James Champagne and Chris Chambers. But I had to make a decision when it was time to go back to college that year because both require a huge commitment, wrestling school and school. And I'm not the type of person that wants to half-ass anything. I want to put my full ass into it. You know what I'm talking about here? So when it came time to go back to school, I had a big decision to make. Was I going to drive an hour each way to go to wrestling school 4 days a week? It was something like $250 a month, which is, kind of the going rate for wrestling school, somewhere around there. And I just had to decide, like, what was more important to me? Was it putting all my effort and all my time into wrestling school or all my effort and all my time into school? And I just figured wrestling school would always be there and I should get my degree, finish my communication studies degree, and figure things out from there. And I got to say, I feel really grateful that I'm able to be a broadcaster that still, dips his toe into the wrestling world every once in a while. And, when I was going to wrestling school in 2003, the indie circuit wasn't set up the way that it's set up now. So I can't imagine if I went down that path that it would be like, if you went to wrestling school now, well, not now, but in a time without quarantine. But if you went to wrestling school in this era, you've got the ability to go to tons of different wrestling shows, tons of different indie shows, all that kind of stuff. You can put your stuff on YouTube and get the word out there. That didn't really exist in 2003. So I have no regrets. I'm happy that I did it. I'm happy that I can get an appreciation for what they do in the ring, but pretty happy with how things have been.
Yeah, a few less bumps, but we'll be talking about some bumps later with your tranny chops, that famous video. So what led you towards being a reporter and interviewer?
It's something I was just always passionate about. And I remember being 4 years old and having a Fisher-Price tape recorder, like with cassette tapes. We're going way back here. And I was pretending to be a radio announcer. And that was I was 4 years old and I was just always really passionate about that and really intrigued by both television and radio. And when you're a kid growing up in the 80s and 90s, like those are the big jobs. Those are the big jobs to be like a host of a TV show or the news anchor. And I just thought it seemed like such an incredible long shot to chase after that goal. And I remember being in high school and we had a class called Communication Studies, which I didn't know much about, but some of my friends were enrolling in it. So I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll take that. And we actually made a newscast every week and you played a different role. Sometimes you were the anchor, sometimes you were the cameraman, the VTR, the audio guy, whatever. And we rotated all the positions. And I just really had this affinity for being in front of the camera. I just loved presenting. And also in high school, I did a little bit of drama. I was the vice president of my student council. So I did the morning announcements. I hosted the talent show. And I was just really drawn to that idea of performing. So when it came time to pick a college major, I took communication studies and realized, well, I was going to be, just learning a lot about how to do that and not actually doing too much of it. So I had this epiphany in my final year of college. I was like, well, when we're done here, we got to graduate and then enter the real world for the rest of our lives and work. Yeah. And it was in that exact moment, I was like, I don't want to hate my job. I want to at least kind of enjoy what I do for a living. And I'm going to try make a real effort to do that now. And if I try and fail, at least when I'm 60, 70, 80, I can look back and go, when I was 21, I tried, it didn't work out. And here I am now. And I reached out to every radio station, every TV station in my college town, said, look, I'm a communication studies major. I'm passionate about this. Can I come in and just see how it's done in the real world? And that's really where it began for me.
Awesome. And I was going through some of your jobs you had in some of the companies. I think one of the companies ended up becoming MTV2, is that right?
Yeah, I was hosting a show called 969 on, it was called Razor at the time, but then ended up becoming MTV2 Canada. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And one of the interviews, which I'll be going all over the place in my timeline, but I suppose one One of the big interviews I noticed you done, and it basically went viral, was your interview with Leslie Mann and Dakota Johnson, where they basically tried to hit on you. So, what was it like doing that interview, and was you uncomfortable?
It was it was completely unexpected. So to
Yeah,
kind of set this up, they were promoting a movie called How to Be Single,
yeah,
and they just weren't, from all my other friends that were going in to do interviews, they weren't getting great material. So I remember my friend walks out of this interview and goes, good luck with that. So it's Leslie Mann and Dakota Johnson. So I'm like, well, I'll just go in there and have some fun. It was a movie about like dating and like, the perils of dating, the ups and downs. So I'd written down these terribly cheesy pickup lines. And my idea was I was going to get them to like rate these terrible pickup lines. But as soon as I sat down, like Leslie Mann was just being like super just fun. And I think that,
yeah,
in a day where they're doing 40 or 50 interviews, 60 interviews, maybe even 100 interviews in a day, I just came in with this energy of like, I'm going to have fun, and if this works out, great. If not, nobody other than us in the room really needs to see this interview. We can just pick out a soundbite that works. And when they started having fun, I just kind of rolled with it. And
yeah.
it's turned into something way bigger than I could have ever expected. The video, I posted it on a Friday afternoon, and by that Monday, it had like over 1 million views.
Wow. And you was a single guy at the time, so you couldn't been complaining too much.
I've no complaints. No complaints.
Cool. And I was looking through some of your videos, and you've done like some reporting on like the red carpet, and I think I got it right. You was doing the Oscars. So, what's it like being on the red carpet? I can imagine there's a lot of hustle and bustle between the reporters, basically pushing each other out the way, and it's like, talk to me, talk to me.
Oh my goodness. A red carpet is like a battleground for reporters because everybody is literally shoulder to shoulder. And you've got just a line of reporters. They all have the same MO as you. They want to try to get, the best interview possible. When you're at the Oscars, you're actually assigned a spot that is 18 inches wide. That's it. They tape it off. It's just wide enough for you to stand. And then on a riser behind you, it's just wide enough for your cameraman to stand there. So it's like super, super tight. And the whole goal on a red carpet is just to try to like flag someone down and get an interview with them. Because they don't necessarily want to talk to everybody. If there's 20, 30, 50 reporters there, they can only do so many interviews. So a lot of those times it's like shouting like, Leonardo, hey, and hope that they come over and talk to you. But as someone who grew up playing sports, I grew up baseball, hockey, wrestling. I was in a lot of bass tournaments growing up, bass fishing tournaments. I feel like that competitive nature is just in me. So when I would get on a red carpet, I'm like, oh, this seems like a competition to me. Let's see what we can get.
It is, and I think I got it right. It was Action News, and was that when you started doing some wrestling interviews? Because I noticed you was at WrestleMania 27 weekend, and you done some interviews with Cody and Dolph Ziggler. So was that the first time you started doing wrestling interviews?
Man, you went way back. You went to the very first videos I posted on my YouTube channel. Right. I love it.
I do my research.
So that was 2011. I'd actually done some wrestling interviews. My first one was in 2007 with Bobby Lashley, and basically every time I went to a new TV station, so I was in Toronto, Vancouver, Cleveland, Miami. Every time I went to a new TV station, I just kind of went, hey, since we're interviewing these actors and we're interviewing these comedians, we're interviewing all these different celebrities, what do you think about a wrestling interview when WWE comes to town? And almost every time, my boss would be like, yeah, of course. No, we do that all the time. So I had these other interviews. I did Bobby Lashley, Mr. Kennedy, Mick Foley. I did some other interviews that just I didn't upload anywhere. Then I kind of realized that like I was already going to WrestleMania 27. I had one of those flip cameras. So we're taking it way back here. One of those.
I know.
And I was like, if I can go there and get some interviews, I'll just put this on my YouTube channel. And that's kind of where it began. And then when wrestlers were coming to town, we would do a little interview that would go on TV. And I thought, well, I want to ask them questions that I like genuinely care about as a fan. So I'm going to ask those questions anyway, just so I can know the answer to this stuff. And then I started putting them on my YouTube channel just so they would live somewhere and other fans could appreciate it. And that's really the crazy story of how this YouTube channel began, like completely by accident.
Yeah, you're on the for wrestling interviews, especially like Pioneers starting your YouTube channel, and like as an independent, I suppose, because obviously we've seen like RF videos, like shoot interviews, but actually being a independent reporter, you're one of the pioneers yourself and Sam, what's his name again?
Sam Roberts.
Sam Roberts, that's right, him as well. It's the one thing I wish I could done. I was thinking, I wish I'd started doing this like 10 years ago. But one of the guys you came across, and you've interviewed him a few times since, The Rock, would you say that was your first mark out moment?
I mean, I'd still get so excited, anytime I've been able to interview The Rock, and I've interviewed him, a handful of 9 times. 9 times, not that I'm counting or anything. I don't know if that's the first one, but that was the one I was most excited about for sure, because when I became an entertainment reporter, The Rock was at the very top of that list. And this is before he was, really making the massive blockbusters that he's making now.
Yeah.
So I became an entertainment reporter in 2006, and I got to interview The Rock in 2012. And this was right when he was on the cusp of like really taking off to the Dwayne Johnson that we know and love now. Like this was as he was preparing for his WrestleMania match with Cena. He was just about to do G.I. Joe 2. He had just done Fast and Furious 5. Like he was just starting to take off. So yeah, look, The Rock's everything you want him to be. He was the absolute very top of my list. And they always say you shouldn't meet your heroes, but if your hero happens to be Dwayne Johnson, you should 100% meet your hero, because he's kind and he's funny and he's charismatic and he's self-aware enough to know that this moment is important for you. And I think a lot of celebrities just go, all right, ask me the question so I can promote my movie or book or whatever. And he's self-aware enough to go, oh yeah, like this moment's big for you. This is going to be reposted everywhere. You're going to share these photos. And he makes the moment really special for you. And he turns the moment around so that you feel, really awesome. And that's a really cool trait to see in anybody, but let alone the arguably biggest star in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I've said to everyone, eventually the guy's going to become president one day. It's a guarantee. So
I mean, it seems like all roads point to that.
Yeah. Cool. And one of the other guys I want to talk about is CM Punk, and you interviewed him as well. So what was CM Punk like?
So that was a really interesting one. That was in Cleveland, where I was working and reporting at the time. And he was scheduled to be hosting the Alternative Press Music Awards. And
that's right.
If we kind of set up the timeline here, Punk had walked out of WWE 6 months before that. No one had seen from him. No one had heard from him. And here he is, like he's walking this red carpet for this thing that's completely different from what we know him from, which is wrestling. Yeah. So I was emailing back and forth with the publicist being like, okay, so CM Punk's going to be there. Can I get an interview with him? And they said, yeah, I mean, he's going to be walking on the red carpet. I'm like, no. I need to set up an interview with CM Punk. Like, it's very important. Yeah. And I remember specifically, they emailed me back and said, absolutely, as long as you don't ask about wrestling. And I'm like, what do you?
It's no point.
What do you mean? So if you watch the interview now, I start off by like, how are you part of this event? This is the Alternative Press Music Awards. How'd you get invited here? What's new with you? He shows his wedding ring off. And it's funny because you can see that I have an earpiece in during that interview.
That's right.
And I was actually doing this interview during the commercial before I had to be live on TV. So as I'm doing the biggest interview in wrestling at that time, I'm still having to like do my day job as being like a news reporter. So I'm doing this interview, and in my ear, I'm hearing my producer going, 1 minute till you're hit. And I'm like, oh, geez, like I haven't even got to the good stuff here yet. 30 seconds. And that's when I asked him the question. He gave the answer. And I was just kind of like, okay, well, thank you very much. Have a good night. And then I had to like say goodbye to him and then turn right around to the camera and be like, okay, we're here live at the Alternative Press Music Awards. There's CM Punk right there. Then I had to go into like news mode, but he was great. And that was 7 years ago. And yeah, it's been a long time. I think the anniversary of him walking out was like 7 years ago this week.
Yeah, so, that's right.
Yeah. And it was, ironically, I was in Cleveland. That was the city that he walked out of. So it's kind of funny how it all kind of came together in that moment. But I'd love to have another interview with him, if he's up for it. I mean, it would be so great to be able to see what's changed in these last 7 years.
Yeah. Personal opinion, do you reckon he'll return one day to wrestling, or do you think he's done?
I would think if it's going to happen, it's going to happen relatively soon. And I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I'm saying this would be a really cool thing to happen. Right now, it's been so, strange watching wrestling with no fans or very little fans.
Yeah.
I think that once we get back on track and, things get back to, quote unquote normal, I think that all of the major wrestling shows are going to announce like a big, huge show. I'm just going to pick a random date here. September 1st. They're going to go, all right, September 1st is our first like all fans show. And they're going to want to bring all the eyeballs to this. So I think in some sort of weird, pie in the sky fantasy booking world, maybe they go, all right, that first show back, CM Punk's returning. Everyone would watch. Everyone would watch. So, but if I like was realistically thinking here, I don't think so. I just think that, that was a time that's passed for him and he's happy doing what he's doing now. And I think that, I think people will continue chanting CM Punk for many years to come, but I don't think he's coming back. What do you think?
I mean, we would like to see it, but it's been a while, 7 years, and obviously he's done no wrestling at all in that time. He's been in UFC a couple of times. So for him to get back into ring shape, it's going to take him quite a while as well. So never say never. I mean, I've always said it, one way or another, everyone, no matter if it was Ultimate Warrior, Bret Hart, Alundra Blaze, Stable, everyone always returns to WWE before it's too late. I mean, you can make the case for Macho Man, but unfortunately, he passed away before he could. I do believe he would have returned. So one way or another, I mean, Jeff Jarrett, he held the company hostage for $250,000. Everyone always finds their way back. So
yeah,
I'm optimistic, but we'll see. But one guy did pop up on WWE TV the other week, Hulk Hogan, and you had the chance to interview him. So what was the Hulkster like?
Oh my gosh, Hogan is such a treat to talk to. And kind of like The Rock, like he's aware of what his stature is, not just as a wrestler, but just as a celebrity figure. And it's funny because the first interview that I did with him was in New Orleans for WrestleMania 30. I interviewed him the morning after he called it the Silver Dome, then he called it the Sky Dome, then it's like, oh no, sorry, it's the Super Dome.
Yeah.
So I did that interview with him the next morning, and then I saw him about a year later. I did an interview with him when he was promoting something for Raw, and he remembered everything. I'm like, oh, it's good to see you again. He's, yeah, brother, I remember. It's New Orleans, WrestleMania 30. And I was like, holy crap. Like, think about how many people he must have met, how many interviews he had done in that past year. And for him to remember those specific details was amazing. And also, like, Hogan is aware that, like, you talk to Terry during the interview, right? You talk to Terry Bollea, but he's aware of, you want to be there with the Hulkster. Yeah. So he starts every interview. Let me tell you something, brother. And like does all the lines, whips them right off and then gets into the interview. And it's like, man, this guy just gets it. He just gets it.
Awesome. And the one thing you're known for is, you travel all up and down the country talking to these guests. I'm hoping to be starting to do something like that myself. Like once things calm down over here, being able to just drive up and to shows and just interview people at the shows would be great. And what's your funniest road trip story? What's happened?
Oh my gosh. Well, so I drive a Tesla now. And this is not some sort of a, brag or a humble brag or anything. I'm just saying, like, I drive a Tesla now. And the Tesla, instead of having a gas tank, has like how many miles left until you need to charge again.
Yeah.
So we were leaving. It was an interview I did with Chris Jericho. We were leaving. There was a long drive. We drove like 4.5 hours to get that interview in Ocala, Florida. This is the one in the backseat of the car right after he signed with AEW. And then we're driving back, and I wanted so desperately to get this interview up like as quickly as possible. So we're driving. I'm driving. My buddy / cameraman / editor is like editing the interview together. And I'm like, as I'm driving, like giving him notes on how to put this thing together. And then the computer dies. So we're like, oh my gosh. Well, what do? We want to get this up as quickly as possible. So we stopped at this like service station in the middle of the highway that happened to, and we were also about to like run out of charge. So we stopped at this service station so we could charge the car and charge the laptop so we can continue editing. So we're sitting in this like tiny little service center, like editing on this laptop in this corner booth while the car is charging, the laptop's charging. The car got like fully charged. I'm like, all right, let's go. We got to get home so we can get to an internet connection so we get this up as quickly as possible. And I'll never forget it. We were driving home and I'm just watching the battery gauge just going down further and further and further. And it's like, we had like 20 miles to go and we had like 20 miles of charge. And I'm like, oh, dude,
Wow.
I don't know what's going to happen. We might get stuck on the side of the road because we got too excited trying to upload this Chris Jericho interview. And it just kept, the more we drove, the less mileage we had. And I thought for sure we were going to end up like stranded on the side of the road, like 4 miles from my house. Instead, I pulled into my driveway with the equivalent of like 0. Pulled into my driveway and I'm like, oh my God. Oh, we made it. And I put the interview up and everything worked out, but I didn't know if it was going to there for a second.
That's cool. And what you've mentioned, you've interviewed some of the big names like The Rock and Hogan, and another guy you've interviewed, John Cena. So what was it like talking to John Cena?
He's the best. Like John Cena is in that position that he's in the company because he's the best. I've interviewed him now 3 times, but I think the one that really stands out is the one I did with him at WrestleMania in New York. So we're talking, geez, we're almost at WrestleMania time again. Wow. Geez. So this was almost 2 years ago. This was 2019. And we had a mutual friend in common who set up this interview. And it was the only interview he did the entire weekend. And I mean, think about it. WrestleMania weekend is both the best and worst time to try to get an interview. The best because anyone that has anything to do with wrestling is all in the same city at the same time. The worst because it's the busiest wrestling weekend of the year. So Cena said, I've got 10 minutes. I can do it right after this interview before I go to this signing. I'm like, perfect, done. So we lined it all up. I took an Uber to this gym in the middle of Manhattan. It's like this private gym. We went up an elevator, and I'm standing at the entrance, like waiting for him. And he sends me a text, and he says, I can't see you, and I'm not trying to be funny. Like, no, I'm right here. I'm like, so like we ended up finding each other. We had exactly 10 minutes. He like walked over like quickly, like shook my hand. All right, let's get into it. So we started doing it at the 10-minute mark. And by the way, the interview was like filled with just so much insight and so much knowledge. He's just dropping all these knowledge bombs everywhere. It was amazing. And one thing he said during that interview, I'll never forget: control the controllable, especially in a time like this. It's so easy to get worried about the things that you have no control over, and you have control over how you want to react in every single situation. So I'll never forget that. But at the 10-minute mark, I very politely started wrapping up the interview, and he reaches in his pocket, grabs his phone and goes, hold on. We've still got more time.
Oh,
what? Oh, how much more time? He's like, just keep going. Like, okay. So he talked for another like 5-ish minutes. I'm like, look, I really want to be respectful of your time. I don't want you to be late. He's like, no, hold on. Looks his phone again. Oh, time for one more question. Oh my gosh. So it went from a 10-minute interview to an almost close to a 20-minute interview. And he was just so kind and so gracious with his time. And, I'll never forget that.
Yeah, I mean, you've probably asked people yourself. When I've had people on who's shared a locker room with John Cena, it's one thing I've always asked them is like, what was John Cena like? And every one of them's always said people don't realize how hard of a worker he is and how good he is around the locker room and how kind he is and giving with his time. So you're just basically confirming all that from like a different point of view.
The crazy thing is, so I spent, let's call it 18 minutes with John Cena in that moment. And here I am 2 years later, still remembering every detail of it and remembering, for him, what's 18 minutes? What's 1 minute? And it's just amazing that he understands that exchange, and just like my story with The Rock, he understands that exchange of his time for your experience. And, you're going to remember that forever.
Awesome. So from a good experience, so we'll we'll turn the tables. So you don't have to mention any names. What's been your worst interview, like your worst experience?
I'd like to think they're like, none of them were like completely terrible. I'd like to think that when cameras are on and microphones are in someone's face, they're like putting on their best face. But I've told this story before. I'll tell it again. I interviewed Christoph Waltz, who's the bad guy from Inglourious Bastards. He was the bad guy in the James Bond film. So I was in Mexico City interviewing him for Spectre. So I was interviewing Daniel Craig, interviewing Dave Bautista, and interviewing Christoph Waltz and a few other people from the cast. And it was just a strange experience. Like I walk into the room and he's standing and there's 2 chairs there. And he's like, "Oh, after you." And I'm like, I don't know, like it's already set up. I'm like, "Which side do I sit on? Like left or right?" "Oh, yeah. This is your seat." And he plays a bad guy in the movie. He's a Bond villain. And I said, "I don't think your character would describe himself as a bad guy. How do you think that he would describe himself?" And then he goes, "It is not my job to do your job for you. I'm not going to tell you what I think of my character. You should tell me what you think of the character." And I'm like,
Wow.
so we kind of didn't start off on a great foot, and the whole interview was like that. And I ended up wrapping it up a little bit early. And then conversely, I interviewed him a few years later for a movie called Alita Battle Angel. And we flew to New Zealand for the interview. Yeah. And I swear to you, James, it's like I interviewed a completely different person. He was funny, and he was warm, and he was friendly, and everything I said, was so funny to him. And I almost feel like, in a way, he's such a good actor, right? He's won 2 Oscars, an incredible actor. His performance in Inglourious Basterds is next level. I almost feel like he embodies a bit of the character when he's doing the interviews. So because he was a bad guy, because he was a Bond villain when I interviewed him in Mexico City, I feel like I got a little bit of that. And then when I interviewed him for Alita Battle Angel, he played like a father character, very caring. And I feel like that was reflecting into the interview too. I don't know. I have nothing bad to say about him, but it was an awkward experience the first time around. And then the next time was like an amazing experience. So I don't know. Maybe he's the greatest method actor ever.
Sounds like he belongs in the wrestling business, keeping kayfabe.
He kayfabed me.
Cool. So you've interviewed loads of wrestlers and that. So what's it like for yourself, like watching wrestling as now? Because like I feel like whenever I've interviewed someone and then I see him on TV like a week or 2 later, I don't know, it must be a bit of a kayfabe in me. I'm like, I kind of want that person to win, like being a bit biased. Do you find yourself that way after you've interviewed someone? Then when you see him on TV next week, it's like, come on, win this match.
I became like, decent friends with Dolph Ziggler because I had interviewed him so many times.
Yeah.
So we would do an interview with him like backstage at Raw, and then a few hours later he'd be on TV, and like I would like jokingly like text him like, I'm in the 15th row, like make sure to point to me. And then he'd be walking down the aisle like pointing, and I'm like, hold on, does that mean he's pointing at me? So I don't like, it's definitely different. Like after you've watched movies, or after you've interviewed actors and you're watching those movies, or when you've interviewed wrestlers and then you're watching their wrestling matches, you kind of feel like you're behind the curtain just a little bit. Maybe just a little bit. Maybe you just have a different kind of appreciation for it. But yeah, like that. Look, the idea of interviewing someone's never going to get old to me, whether they're a wrestler or an actor, a celebrity, comedian, whatever. I'm just fascinated by like figuring out like what makes people tick, like what makes successful people so successful. And when you start looking at all these traits, they all have like really similar things in common.
Yeah, true. But that's what I found, like interviewing wrestlers. It's like, well, like saying what you just said, so many things in common and things like well, we'll get to it later with 90 seconds, but like in like same TV shows, movies, and things like that. So it's crazy. And one of the things I want to talk about is AEW, and like one of my fellow podcasters asked me, Universal Wrestling Podcast, shout out, what's your status with AEW? Because am I right, you were signed with them as a reporter, but we haven't seen you on TV since. So what's the status?
Well, I was signed to be part of the first episode. So that's anything after that was like a lovely bonus. And man, I got to tell you, like as a wrestling fan, to be part of the first wrestling show on TNT in almost 20 years, and I played a very small part of that, but to just be part of that show was so cool. So they asked me to be part of that first episode, which was October 2nd, live from Washington, D.C. I was blown away that they asked me to be part of that, but that's all I expected it to be. And then they called me a few weeks later and asked me to be part of another show, which is where I did the interview with Rock and Roll Express, which got broken up by Santana and Ortiz. We were in Charleston, West Virginia for that, but man, to be part of just one of them was really cool. Then to be part of another one was even cooler. Then I did some stuff with the Road to series on YouTube. Yeah. It was really cool. So I don't really have a status there. What you saw was what it is, and we're living in a really strange time right now where all the wrestling companies are kind of working with, the smaller crews. So never say never. Who knows what's going to happen, when the world does get back to some sort of normalness. But yeah, it was a really cool thing to be able to be part of that.
Awesome. And one of the videos we saw from last year, which blew up and it blew your chest up, you could say as well, was your 20 chops with Breeze and Spears. So we've mentioned that you've done some wrestling training back in the day. What was it like taking them chops? Because they look pretty. I felt them when you put it on Instagram. When you saw it, I actually felt. I was like, ow.
Yeah, a few of those. Oof. I watch them back now. And I'm like, oh. That whole segment was my idea because I had interviewed Shawn Spears previously, like right after he left WWE, right before he got into AEW. I did an interview with him.
Yeah.
And he was like, oh, I opened up this wrestling school in Florida. I'm like, well, I want to come and check it out. Maybe I'll take a few bumps. And so we finally lined up the time to go in there and do it. And I said, look, I'll take a few bumps. I'll run the ropes. We'll lock it up. And Spears goes, well, what if I give you a chop? And I'm like, okay, that's one chop. I can take a chop. I said, I think it'd be a little bit more interesting if you lined up all your students and had them chop me. And he's like, oh, okay. So there were 8 students plus Breeze and Spears. Little did I know that at their wrestling school at Flatbacks, everybody gets 2 chops. So I had agreed to think, okay, I can take 10 chops, one from each person. When they said, all right, we're doing 20 chops and the camera was already rolling, I'm like, okay. All right, sure. We've gone this far. And some of them didn't hurt. I think you could see which ones don't really sting. But some of them, especially that first one that Breeze gave me, just so loud. Yeah. And my chest was bruised for almost a week. My chest was bruised for 6 days. But when we took that photo, which is the thumbnail for the video, that was at the very peak of when it was red and welted. Because by the time I got back to my hotel that night, it was already starting to subside a little bit. And I'll never forget, Breeze goes, Spears. Spears goes, just buy some aloe vera, rub that on there. It's it's a bad sunburn. Okay, sure enough. Of course, we're in Orlando, where my hotel was. Of course, lots of people go to Disney World and get sunburned. So, of course, the hotel lobby was, stocked full of aloe vera that I could just buy and rubbing that all over myself. And yeah, it's something I'll never forget.
Cool. And I think that's one of the things what myself and other people enjoy about your interviews. And I suppose it kind of helped because, you've done them for a few weeks in wrestling school, so it's helped. But you're so interactive with your interviews. You're not scared to, do the chops, or when you was interviewing John Morrison doing springboards. Pretty sweet springboard, by the way. But obviously, with COVID, it's put a stop to them things. So is that one of the biggest things you miss? Obviously, I think you've started doing interviews in person again, but is that one of the biggest things you've missed, being able to interview people in person?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's just something different about doing an interview in person. There's just something so different about meeting someone in person. You can shake their hand, you can look them in the eye, you can feel their energy. And that's something that doesn't really happen when you're doing it as a Zoom or a Skype interview. Look, it's amazing that we live in this time right now where this is even possible. That you and I are on other sides of the planet right now, talking like we're sitting next to each other. But if there's something that could just give me even a 1% edge to make the interviews that much better, I want to do that. I want to get every advantage that I can. So I look forward to that happening again. Who knows when that's going to be, but we've all pivoted. I didn't own this microphone before COVID. I didn't own this webcam here, before COVID. So when this pandemic first started, I was 2 weeks in, I'm I think that this is going to be a thing. And even if it's only a thing for another few weeks, they still have the gear to do this.
Awesome. And like we mentioned, you've told a couple of funny stories already with some of your interviews, but what would you say has been your funnest interview you've done?
The Rock's gotta be it. He meant so much to me growing up. And I would ask people questions in high school just so I could respond. It doesn't matter what you think. That would be me all the time. I was raising people's eyebrow. I dressed up as The Rock for Halloween one year. So yeah, The Rock. And then a close second is an interview I did with Tom Cruise because he's my favorite actor. He's the last remaining movie star, if you really think about it. And to be able to interview him I got him at the Mission Impossible red carpet in Paris, in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. It's such a cool photo. So yeah, those two for sure.
Awesome. And you've interviewed, like we said, The Rock, Hogan, Cena, like some of the biggest names of all time. So who's left on the bucket list for you?
In the wrestling realm, it's Vince McMahon. And I don't
Yes.
know if that's going to happen, but I would love to just get in Vince's head, figure out like what makes him tick. Like what's the first 30 minutes of Vince McMahon's day look like? What's Vince McMahon's workout routine look like? I would just love to learn that kind of stuff. I want to interview Vince McMahon, the person, Vince McMahon, the businessman, not just Vince McMahon, the wrestling promoter. I don't know if it's possible, but I'm going to keep throwing it out in the world, and hope that it is possible. I'd also love to sit down with Oprah. I've interviewed her briefly, but a long interview with Oprah because she's an incredible interviewer. Joe Rogan, who I'm blown away by Joe Rogan, his ability to take something that he's passionate about and turn it into a job. He loves MMA. He's a UFC commentator. He loves comedy. He's a comedian. He loves having conversations with people. He's, one of the biggest podcasters in the world. I'm fascinated by that.
What did you think to the Undertaker interview the other day?
Yeah. I mean, look, Joe Rogan, I don't think has had a bad interview. And he just has this amazing ability of getting the best out of somebody. Yeah, it's a great interview. And the few interviews that he's done with wrestlers have always been really, really good.
Yeah.
So I hope that maybe we get a few more this year.
Awesome. So we're nearing the end. So we're down to the 90s segment. So we talked about off camera. So some 90s based questions, personality. Let the people know a bit, even though they know a lot about you, just give them that little bit more of an insight into you.
Oh, I see what you did there.
Oh, yeah, I'm good. So, Chris, what's your favorite 90s movie?
Favorite 90s movie is Jurassic Park.
Oh, well, cool.
Love that movie. What's the popular answer on this question?
Mixed. It's mixed, to be fair. I had the weirdest one. So you watch Impact Wrestling. So Jessica Havoc. So she's dressed up like Mad Max, Resident Evil sort of gear. She gave me the interview clueless. I was like, really? Clueless?
Wow. Okay.
I would not have that. Out of all the ones I've asked, that's the one which just stuck out at me because you just couldn't line the two up together at all.
Yeah. I would also say Scream is a close runner-up for me.
Awesome. Cool. Favorite 90s TV show?
Seinfeld.
Seinfeld.
Seinfeld's just so brilliant. It still holds up now.
Never seen it.
Oh my goodness, this interview's over.
I've heard of it, and I know how big it was in America, but I've never actually. I've seen like clips probably, and like from what I've seen, it's good, but I've never actually said. I couldn't actually say I've sat down and watched like one episode of it, so that's something I need to start doing. Yeah. I don't know if you was a video game player back in the day, but what was your favorite 90s video game?
I'm going to give you two because I played these two more than anything else in the 90s. NHL 97, because I grew up in Canada. Of course, I loved hockey. And there was this like deke move that you could do. So NHL 97 and NBA Jam Tournament Edition.
Yes. Awesome. And we'll move it back to the wrestling. A favorite 90s wrestler? I think I know what the answer is going to be.
Yeah, it's going to be the most electrifying man in all of entertainment.
Awesome. And your favorite 90s tag team?
Oh man, that's a tough one. I'm going to go with Edge and I'm going to go with the Hardys.
Yeah.
Although that's not very encompassing of all the 90s, but I was so inspired by Jeff Hardy. So I'm going to go with the Hardy Boys.
Awesome. And the hardest one's last. Favorite 90s match?
Oh my goodness. I always revert back to my favorite match of all time, but it happened in 2002. Rock Hogan.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to go with Mankind and Undertaker Hell in a Cell, just because it was such a pivotal moment for me to go, oh, this is what wrestling is now? Like you just threw that man off of the top of Hell in a Cell through an announce table and he might be dead. So I'm going to go with that.
Yeah, I was watching Beyond the Mat the other day, and it showed you like clips from that Hell in a Cell match. Like the main focus is on Mankind and Rock at Royal Rumble and 12 chair shots. but showed you the clip from Hell in the Cell. I was like, man, however he survived them falls, it
I
just like
don't
astounds me.
It's like probably inches away from being paralyzed or killed.
Yeah, true.
Because the table doesn't really break your fall that much. So he basically just fell right into concrete. And I also feel like Jim Ross and Jerry the King Lawler didn't know that was about to happen.
Yeah, that's true. But the way Jim Ross reacted to it was like, yeah, you can tell that was legit. He had no idea.
But also they were standing like right there. Like they could have been landed on. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Right, Chris, it's been a pleasure having you. So before we sign off, do you want to tell everyone about your YouTube channel and where they can find you on social media?
So wherever you're listening to this right now, you can find my podcast called Insight with Chris Van Vliet. And on social media, I'm at Chris Van Vliet, and my YouTube channel also at Chris Van Vliet. So please say hello and let us know that you were listening to this one.
Awesome. And before we do sign off, what's your advice for any budding interviewers or podcasters out there?
You got to start. That's the biggest advice. There's too many people that talk about doing it, and there's too many people that dream about doing it. You got to put one foot in front of the other and actually start doing this thing. I tweeted this recently, but it's a quote that I love, and it's day one is greater than one day. And so many people talk about one day I'll do this, one day I'll do that.
Yes.
Well, one day should be today. Like start taking some steps today that your future self's going to thank you for later. And your future self is you an hour from now. Your future self is you tomorrow. Your future self is, of course, you 6 months from now and a year from now and 5 years from now. So start taking those steps now that are going to make you a better version of yourself in the future.
Awesome. Well, Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Like I said, I'm still relatively new to this, so to get like the main man himself onto the show and giving these words of wisdom and telling these great stories like with The Rock, Hogan, Cena, absolutely great pleasure to hear. So thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, the pleasure's mine. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Cool. And hopefully we'll do it again.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Cool.